Hi, I'm LevUNknown, the lead developer of the visual novel RPG Mistwinter. It's a massive story-driven game where you rule a fantasy town called Mistwinter. You get to build buildings, decide who lives in the town, socialize with characters and much more. Today I'll be talking about the process my sister Wogglawooh and I use to create and add characters to the game. There's a heavy focus on characters in this game, which means that this is the core feature with tons of work behind it. This means that I mention everything from writing to playtesting. There's a lot to cover, so let's get into the details, shall we? The very first thing we do when we create a character is write a character description. And by we, I mean me. This description includes everything you can see in the character roster in the game, which is basic information like name and social class and more detailed info like the biography. This is the type of information that is directly transferred into the game's character roster. Of course, the character description we write for ourselves is a lot longer most of the time, since it often describes a way more detailed backstory and includes things like personality and interests as well. And stats. Every character in the game has stats that decide how good they are at certain tasks. Most of these stats are linked to a character's personality, so I haven't changed many of the stats since I first started writing the character descriptions about 3 years ago. But I might have to change some when we start playtesting the entire game properly. When I've written a detailed description of a character, I hand that description over to my sister, Wogglawooh, who draws the art. And when I say draws, I actually mean drew in past tense, since all the main characters are done now. Anyway, in addition to the character description, I also leave a few extra sentences, or sometimes just a few words, to describe the character's appearance. I try to keep it a bit loose to give her a lot of creative freedom, but if I have a really clear image of what the character looks like, or if they have something very unique about their appearance, like Zane here, I'll be a bit more thorough. I also give her a sketch of the character's basic emotions to ensure that the character's personality shines through in its expressions. So Wogglawooh then draws the character's body, 4 basic facial expressions and blush. Now we have the foundation for our character, so it's time to move on to the actual game engine. In case you don't know, a game engine is basically a computer program where you can make games. The game engine we used for Mistwinter is called GameMaker Studio 2. In the game engine I add the building that the character is linked to, that is the smithy for Gale or the guard barracks for Celia. Adding a building is basically just copying information from existing buildings and changing it to fit this one, like specifying which sprite it has, how much it costs to build, which resource it produces, etc. I add the building before the character, since in the actual game you have to build the building to get the character. I can work my way around that when I playtest, but I'll talk more about that later. This step is similar to the previous one in the sense that it is copying existing information from one character and changing it to fit a new one. This information is stored in something called an array, which is very easy to go through to check information if you have a lot of information to check, which is often the case in this game since there will be 38 dateable characters. Anyway, one thing that makes adding a character different to adding a building is to make sure its face is in the right place. In Mistwinter, a character's mouth and eyes are animated separately, which means they are separate from each other and the body. This means that every new character needs a bit of surgery to move their face from this position to the correct one. I do this by adding the sprites in an empty room in the game and then adjusting the facial features to the correct position. I then copy the values of the position into the array that stores all the information about the character. Now we finally get to the creative writing with the in event, where you get to meet the character for the first time if they visit the town. This event doesn't only introduce the character to the player for the first time, but to me as well. Since all characters have 4 basic facial expressions, it's important for me to get a feel for their expressions and emotions before I start writing things properly. And I say properly because even though a character's in event is very much a proper event, it's still just a very short introduction that you may or may not see as a player. And I treat it as both a way to see the character in action for the first time as well as get a feel for who they are. Because writing a character description is very different from writing actual dialogue. A character should talk and act in a unique way, which isn't easy to portray in a description. So I use the in-event as a way to see and get to know the character before I write the rest of the events. In other words, I write the in-event and then immediately add it to the game so that I can proofread and playtest it at the same time. That way I get a visual image of the character, often with several different expressions, in my head that I can use as a reference when I write the rest of the events. Then it's on to writing the events in question. A character's events are the core character-driven gameplay in Mistwinter Bay, and it's where you get to know a character properly. Every character has 5 hangout events, a proposal event, a personal quest, a negative reputation event, 3 married life events, and other minor things. A character's endings are included here too. I write the events as code straight from the get-go, which means I'll be able to copy-paste everything into the game engine and be able to test it out right away. This saves a lot of time compared to writing it in a more traditional way and then copy-pasting every character name and line of dialogue into code. For those of you who know some programming, I'll explain later why I don't read it from a text document instead. The dialogue system is based on the only gamemaker asset I've ever gotten, which is the EdgeVN asset from Xcasoft. If you want to try to make visual novels in gamemaker, I recommend buying this asset, especially if you're new to programming. I made some workarounds with this asset by skipping some features and so on, since it doesn't always work the way I want it to. There isn't much more to be said about writing the events other than that I try to carry on the vibe of the character from the in-event. Although if they develop as a character in the events, I'll of course adapt their behaviors accordingly. When all of a character's events are written, I add them to the game. Adding them means copying the dialogue into the game engine, into a so-called object. If you know anything about coding, you might wonder why I add it directly to an object and not read it from an external txt file or something. That's because I need to see these numbers when I do things like change facial expressions. Going to a separate document to see that would be a hassle to me. It's easier to manage spelling errors and fix bugs when I have direct access to the dialogue like this too. Besides, given how many events and things there are in the game, there would be a lot of external text documents which take up storage space and unnecessary reading and loading times for them, especially since objects still have to be in the game engine for it to work. But most importantly, I've already added a lot of content this way, and I'm not going to rework it just to put in external documents. Of course, having the dialogue like this always in code format directly in the game engine would make adding multiple languages to Mistwinter Bay a lot more complicated than other games. But I unfortunately have to say that it's highly unlikely that there will be translations to it. Professional translations cost money. Most translation companies and translators usually charge per word translated. Since Mistwinter Bay had more than 600,000 words last time I checked, which was many months ago now, and it's going to go up in the millions of words no doubt, it's simply not feasible for us to translate it. I mean, even if someone wants 1 cent per word, that's still a lot of money. Of course, if the English release is a massive hit and we earn tons of money, we might add an additional language in the future, but right now I wouldn't get my hopes up. So, back to the implementation info. Each event is added in a chronological order, starting with Hangout 1 and ending with the endings, or the negative reputation event, since that's somewhat of a special case. Adding an event means adding the text, linking dialogue options to the right part of the text, changing character emotions, changing reputation, and so on. This is where the main programming work is done. I save myself a lot of time by duplicating existing events, that is, other characters' events, and just changing the numbers and names in certain places. Of course, it's a bit more complicated than that at times, but almost all events contain the same fundamental functions, so simply duplicating an existing one means I don't have to add those basic things from scratch. On average, setting the right facial expressions is probably the most time-consuming part. Each event is immediately tested in a vacuum. By that I mean it's tested in a special room in the game engine without any of the UI and other mechanics that the usual game is relying on. You can actually see in our videos when I have recorded things in the testing room, since it's a lot easier to just add an event into the testing room to record it rather than play the entire game until that point. I obviously prefer to do that. When I test the events in this vacuum, I can also very easily change many of the variables that decide what happens. Like, for example, if a character needs another character for their negative reputation event, I can just move them in by changing a single number in their character information. And if it's necessary to have a certain amount of gold, or if you must have built a prison to get access to certain dialogue options, I can change that too. Testing characters in this stage of the implementation basically means that I check so that all variables are proper and that all options are available at the right time. It also means checking facial expressions and grammar. If I notice something when playtesting, I write it down in my notebook. I write the beginning of the line of dialogue so that I can search for that specific line, and then what it is that I should fix and how I should fix it. Usually it's just small remarks like adding a comma when I forgot one, but sometimes it's bigger things like characters not leaving when they should, or that I should add a sound effect. When every event has been added, I interact with the character as intended from start to finish to ensure that everything works as it should on a large scale. By this I mean if the events lead to each other correctly and so on. Although I do make things easier for myself by making sure I have enough resources to build their building from the starting month, and have enough coins to buy them gifts and an engagement ring, and shorter time between married life events, and a keyboard shortcut to get to the endings. Yeah, it's not exactly a proper 100% realistic playthrough, but hey, it's mainly testing, not playing. When all of that is done, we have ourselves a complete functioning character. As for how long this process takes, it's hard to tell, mostly because I never tracked the time it took to write the character descriptions. I did that back in 2020, long before I started programming the game. The art for the character usually takes Wogglawooh 2 to 3 hours. For me, writing every event related thing takes about 1 week, which means 5 days of work. Implementing the events and playtesting takes about 4 to 5 days, depending on how complicated some of the events are. I've gotten a lot faster at implementing characters recently, it seems. Then again, I've been doing it for many hours now, so I sure hope I've become more efficient. If you want to get a feel for Mistwinter Bay yourself, you can play the demo for free on itch.io or Steam. Please consider wishlisting the game on Steam to get notified when it releases, hopefully sometime next year. And that's all for me this time. I'll see you in another video.